In the early 16th century, a woman named Juliana Vinkerin claimed to have been part of what she called a good society, a collection of women who were living in the service of a female deity, a kind of fairy queen. The good society was beneficent, and with their fairy queen, they would travel from house to house, eating, drinking, playing music, and bestowing blessings. On one such evening, Juliana claimed that one of her fellow members fulfilled what seemed to be some sort of religious calling when she raised a baby from the dead. Here's the thing, though. That good society had also killed and eaten the baby to begin with. Welcome to the Nordic Animism channel, where we recover traditional knowledge and North European animism. My name is Maddie, and today I'll be looking at some possible explanations for why we find so many stories of witches eating people, especially young children, and in the process explore the wider associations between women, death, and fate. The 15th to 17th century saw the witch as cannibal image, especially the witch who eats young children, cemented into Western consciousness, with much of the classic witch imagery we know coming from this time period. In his analysis of early modern witch iconography, Professor Charles Zika views this cannibalism as an expression of social anxiety, citing key shifts like the colonization of the Americas and perceptions of Amerindian cannibalism, anti-Semitism, major religious shifts, and anxieties around female sexuality. Cannibalism and cannibalistic motifs are also attested in early modern witchcraft confessions. And while the integrity of confessions made under duress can be questionable, there are also confessions and folkloric accounts that were freely volunteered. Juliana Vinkerin and her Good Society is one such example. There are also similar figures and motifs that continued after the pre-modern witch hunts had ended. So what could account for an authentic witch as cannibal narrative? Cannibalism is an important element of what British historian Emma Wilby sees as a kind of death divination, which she theorizes is a function of witches and other supernatural women. The idea goes something like this. A witch or group of witches engages in some kind of ritual killing. This is usually done on a visionary plane, like in a dream, after which the body is dismembered and eaten, then temporarily resurrected, again, presumably on a visionary plane. This would allow the witch to foresee the death of an individual on a physical plane, i.e. the killing functioned as a form of death divination. This information would then be passed on to others in the community, sometimes including the individual who was soon to die. But understanding how Wilby reaches this conclusion requires us to look at the wider relationships between women, death, and fate. Wilby surveys a spectrum of female figures and begins with fate goddesses or fate women, usually a trio of female figures. The three main Norns of Norse mythology, Parkai or Morai for Greco-Roman mythology, and in some interpretations, the three Morigna of Irish mythology. The words fae and fairy are derived from the Latin word fata, meaning destiny, suggesting a connection between fairies, elves, and fate goddess figures. In Central and Southeastern Europe, this connection was overt, with fate goddesses being described as very similar to fairies in appearance. The Regensmal also offers a link between fate women, in this case Norns, and elves. So one's fate could be spun by an elven Norn. The relevance of fate goddess figures continued into the Christian period. In the 10th century, Buhart of Worms described how the vulgar believed in the fates and in their ability to control the lives of men. The Hungarian folklorist Eva Pox reported that fate goddesses played real roles in the religious lives of individuals, and in some places in Central and Southeastern Europe were present figures in birth, marriage, and death ceremonies. This channel has pointed out some potential Nordic examples, like where Norn porridge was the name for the first meal that a midwife ate after delivering a child. There are also a range of supernatural female figures whose roles were specifically to bring about or herald death. The Anglo-Saxon charm with Verstice lists a handful of such women, among them the Aesir, elves, mighty women, or Dominican Whiff, and Hagtesen, which roughly translates to supernatural females or simply as hags, mostly interpreted as some kind of witch. The charm specifically aims to cure being elf shot by the Hagdison, which was to be hit with supernaturally forged arrows or little spears. The phrase mighty women is interesting because it is present in texts that both pre- and post-state the with vestigia charm, and is open enough to relate to many different configurations of martial women. This opens up Wilby's analysis to the Norse Valkyrie and Valkyria, who, alongside the Celtic Marigna, act as or serve gods of war, ride or fly onto battlefields to direct affairs, are associated with the raven and the crow, and are notoriously bloodthirsty. The term choosers of the slain appears a number of times in Anglo-Saxon and Latin vocabularies, and while a lot of associated terms are not interchangeable, they do act as glosses for one another. The word Valkyria appears as early as the 8th century and is sometimes used as a gloss for Furies and various other figures related to fate and slaughter in the classical world, like the Roman goddess Bellona. Meanwhile, Valkyrie is sometimes used as a gloss for Gorgon. The Valkyries are, of course, perhaps the most well-known figures in this complex of supernatural fate women. The Daradayod describes them as fierce supernatural beings that delight in carnage, and tells the story of the Valkyries weaving human entrails with swords and arrows, and using men's heads as weights, which is also my activity of choice for girls' night. Their weaving is reminiscent of the weaving you often find among fate goddess figures, where the Norns or the Greek fates weave the threads of fate, indicating that the Valkyrie's role extends beyond simply executing the deaths ordered by war deities, something more akin to the role of the Marigna. The Sigurdrifamal confirms that Valkyries have at least the agency to alter fate when Sigdrifa defies Odin's commands and keeps Sigurður from dying in battle. The association between the supernatural female warrior figure and fate can also be seen in the fairy belief of Irish and Scottish folklore with the Banshee, which is viewed by some scholars as deriving from the Marigna. The Banshee would announce death with keening or by being encountered before battle, or sometimes, like the Marigna, being spotted washing the clothes of one who was soon to die. Human participation often took place in what Wilby calls a spirit group narrative, which most commonly took the form of a house-to-house procession. Wild hunt variants are a key example. These processions were led by one or more supernatural and often female figures and consisted of deities, fairies, demons, the dead, and living participants. Written sources from the 9th century onward attest to beliefs that at certain times of the year, a supernatural woman, sometimes with a male companion, traveled at night with a large company of spirits, riding animals or in animal forms themselves. Elites usually assigned classical deities to these stories like Diana or Hecate, or sometimes Germanic figures like Holda, Perchta, and Lusa, both or all of whom who have been cited as early leaders of the wild hunt. But there are actually many different names for similar figures across Europe. Raquella, Good Mistress, Mistress of the Good Game, Madonna Horiente, the Matron, Lady Abundia, Wise Sibyl, or just the Lady. People would open up their pantries in anticipation of the leading female figure and her followers, and believed they would receive abundance in return. In 13th century Paris, one bishop complained that local people believed in ladies of the night who served Lady Abundia, and later Abundia and her companions would visit homes to eat and drink what was left out for them. In 16th century Switzerland, many alleged to have seen the Saligen Lute, a fairy-like society that moved through Lucerne, playing instruments and feasting on food that was left out by families, hoping for blessings. In many of these accounts, the amount of food was said to be untouched, or at least replenished by morning. Humans, usually but not exclusively women, who were interested in healing, divinatory knowledge, and other shamanic practices could seek to join these processions, as their female leaders sometimes granted magical powers. A woman in 14th century Milan reported that Madonna Horiente gifted her and other members of their nighttime procession magical powers, showing them the efficacy of herbs and everything they wanted to be shown about sicknesses, thefts, and bewitchings. A Sicilian healing woman claimed to have cured a patient by appealing to her society of Doñas de Fuera, fairy-like beings, to make her patient well again, and you see similar cases in northeastern Italy with the Benedenti. Scots also believed that joining the fairy queen would yield the same results, although records demonstrating this are less detailed and more demonized than their Italian counterparts. Most simply state something along the lines of, I went with the fairies, or I got my skill from the fairies. A Nordic comparison might be the Orskong Vision Quest complex, that is a mouthful, which has been discussed in another video. Trances, dreams, and other subtle body experiences were common ways for one to join a spirit group's procession. This could be voluntary, but it could also be by force. 19th century folklorist Magnus Landstedt wrote that during the Askereia, a Norwegian variant of the Wild Hunt, one woman experienced an involuntary separation from her body, saying that the Asgardsta had made off with her. She entered a coma-like state, and when she returned, described having ridden with a nighttime horde. This is the original meaning of the words like rapture, or the Latin-derived ecstasis, from the Greek word meaning to stand out or standing out, meaning to be outside of your body. The Danish word bjartein also denotes something similar, literally meaning taken into a mound. The Mazari, or dream hunters, were a predominantly female group in 19th and 20th century Corsica who left their bodies in a dream or dreamlike state, during which they would meet together in packs, then hunt and kill an animal. Once the animal was dead, it would be recognized as a human member of their community that would die shortly thereafter. Or, if the woman had only succeeded in wounding the animal, that person might suffer an illness or accident. The Mazari described their participation as a call to hunt, feeling neither animosity nor affection towards the animal or person. Even if the animal corresponded to a family member or a friend, once called, the woman entered an almost battle frenzy-like state. Wilby compares the Mazari to early modern witchcraft confessions as part of her death divination hypothesis. Specifically, she marks the similarities between them and each of their feelings of moral ambiguity in relation to their role. For instance, the Confessions of Isabel Gowdy, who was tried and presumably executed for witchcraft in 17th century Scotland, describes Isabel and her coven flying with a fairy host, headed by a fairy queen and king and the devil. Isabel describes using elf arrows, the same mention and with Festicia, to shoot and kill people below as part of their procession. Sometimes she shows malice to those she harms, notably individuals that abused their power over her, but Isabel also shows great sadness and remorse, claiming it was the devil that forced her to join their processions and kill others. The Mazari also often showed remorse for their participation in the hunt. One story tells of a Mazer who tearfully approaches her friend and announces that she had gone on a dream hunt during which she had killed her friend's child, who would soon die in the waking world. She also says that she would spend the rest of her life trying to make good for the harm that she had caused. Importantly, however, that remorse is not exactly guilt. Many of the Mazari did not consider themselves directly responsible for the deaths of the people that they killed, and neither did their communities. Mazari were held in high regard, considered to be carrying out the will of God. In both the case of the Mazari and Isabel Gowdy, this lack of autonomy suggests that there is something innate in these women, perhaps a prescribed role or fate that demands there is a divinatory function in the way that they experience killing a person about to die. Wilby's death divination theory doesn't focus very much on the eating of human flesh itself, but it does hinge on what comes after. In many stories in this video, the eating of a human body is followed by a partial or full resurrection. When Juliana Vinkerin and her good society kill and eat a baby, they gather its bones and raise the baby from the dead. John of Salisbury records women following a female deity devouring infants, only for the deity to decide to return the babies to their cradles. In 1008, Buhart of Worms alludes to a female-led spirit group whose women are able to travel through closed doors and kill the unbaptized with invisible weapons, cooking and eating them. They then fill the remaining dead bodies with straw, which grants them a brief spell of life, although they later die again. Isabel Gowdy's confessions report the same stuffing of corpses with straw to reanimate them, and in Milan, women were known to do similar things, but with livestock. Interestingly, this delay in death caused by stuffing the body is mirrored in the Mazari. After eating the pseudo-body, arguably a type of cannibalism, there is a period of time before the human form also dies. In early modern witchcraft, the human body is eaten, then stuffed with straw, which allows others to perceive the person as alive for a little while longer. Both accounts share this liminal space, and according to Wilby, this liminal space is key in deducing these acts as a form of divination. And then also makes sense why so many of these cases involve young children. In the pre-industrial age, child mortality rates were much higher than they are today. So to recap, Wilby views witches to be part of the wider complex of death and fate women found in different forms throughout Europe. The murder and consumption of their victims acts as a form of divination, as their bodies are partially resurrected, as part of marking them for a future true death. While I find Wilby's research endlessly fascinating, I can't help feeling like there are some problems with it. The first problem is pretty straightforward and would probably be raised by many practitioners. Assuming that the main or only objective here is divination, the ritual complex laid out by Wilby is a lot of work. While divination can take on many forms, they're usually not this labor-intensive. They might involve casting or reading or something, cards, bones, intestine, shells, things like that. To me, the complex that Wilby describes seems more akin to something like the Orskong Vision Quest, but what the aim might be is not elaborated on. Second, it's possible that Wilby still underplays the history of Christian demonization. She does definitely acknowledge it, especially in regards to Protestant areas like Scotland, but I think the death divination interpretation puts too much emphasis on the death-bringing capabilities of these Witch As Cannibal and related figures, and too little emphasis on the implied life-bringing capabilities. Fate goddesses, for instance, are associated with both life and death, spinning threads of fate and then cutting them. Wilby seems to suggest that these early modern witchcraft stories resemble something closer on the spectrum of the death-bringing women we hear about in the With Verstice charm, and in accounts like Isabel Gaudi's, that certainly seems to be the case. Her description of the elf arrows matches with Verstice so particularly that the scholar Alaric Hall suggested a direct belief transmission between them, so it makes sense to associate Isabel with the Hagdusin. Even these dreadful women that With Verstice describes do seem to have some ability to choose between life and death. I've already mentioned Sigurdrifa protecting Sigurður. I've seen some suggest that the Hagdusin have a possible tie to necromancy, citing some linguistic gymnastics as evidence. The linguistics are dubious, but given the transmission between the Hagdusin and Isabel Gaudi, it may not be unfair to speculate that the Hagdusin also had some life-bringing capabilities. I mean, is there really such a big gap between necromancy and resurrection? And there are more than a few examples where death-associated women seem to have a change of heart, or at least they're willing to alter the fate of those doomed to die, even in situations where they were the ones that doomed them in the first place. In France, John of Salisbury recorded beliefs that a mistress of the night summons gatherings and assemblies in which infants were dismembered and gluttonously devoured, while the mistress takes pity on others and has them put back in their cradles. In the case of the Benedanti, one example tells of the leading female deity instructing her followers to put a curse on others, but those curses could be removed if requested. Another example tells of a man who begs his friend, here again a Benedanti, to remove the curse that she put on presumably his child. He does this by pointing out that he and the Benedanti are good friends, and she's moved by the affection she has for him and removes the curse that she placed. Similar ambiguities play out with the Doñas de Fuera, whose Doñas claim to attend meetings with the fairies to persuade them to cure illnesses that they themselves had caused. Even more so, many of the women mentioned in this video were self-identified healers, and the deities they associated with had healing functions. I also think it's fair to extend this to a wider sense of life-bringing, abundance, fertility. Spirit groups and the supernatural beings associated with them are often described as dangerous, capable, and very willing to kill the mortals they come in contact with. But they're also very capable of showing benevolence. Leaving gifts behind or blessings, wealth, and abundance were common characteristics of house-to-house processions. The Oscarea in Norway featured tales where people who ventured out after dark on the night of the hunt being murdered and taken by the horde. However, the presence of the writers sometimes signified a good year on the farm, and those who helped in the hunt were rewarded with ordinary objects that later transformed into gold. The fairy host or slua that Isabel described was generally considered dangerous. It could whisk people away to join the host, presumably killing them, but it was also said that the host would occasionally rescue people trapped on cliffs. Now, Wilby does note the moral ambiguity of many of these figures in her original argument, and while ambiguity is present, I think the ability or the choice of the figure to employ either side denotes a certain well-roundedness. You often see deities with contrasting aspects of themselves. Freya is maybe an apt comparison as both goddess of love and war. Still, child cannibalism is a hallmark of demonization. The Romans accused the Christians of child cannibalism, Christians accused the Jews of cannibalism, as Professor Zika pointed out earlier, and today it still features in political conspiracy theory. It just seems like the kind of thing you do when you don't really like a group of people that much. But I don't want the answer to be just demonization. Like, throw the goth kids a bone here. Cannibalism is just cool. So I'm going to indulge myself and wedge in a little bit of a third option here. While I do think Wilby neglects some of the life-bringing capabilities and focuses too much on the death-bringing capabilities of these witch figures, I also think it might be an error to dismiss claims of cannibalism as slander from an oppressive elite or majority, because we do have accounts like Juliana Vinkeren's where she volunteers information about the good society's participation in the killing and eating of a child. Violence is sometimes a vital part of animist ritual, and here I really have to recommend our video called Why Are the Norse Gods Abusive? It's a little too sophisticated for me to synthesize here properly, but please, please, please go watch it. It's one of my favorite videos that we've put out on the channel. Sacrifices in Animist Violence is another video from a slightly different angle that might also be helpful. I'll link both in the description below. Dismemberment and, to some extent, cannibalism often features in creation myths, where the dismembered body is scattered and forms the basis for worlds and landscapes. The murder and dismemberment of Ymir by Odin and his brothers is the obvious Nordic example. Similar examples include Purusha in Hindu mythology, Geomart in Zoroastrian mythology, Adam Kadmon in some Kabbalistic traditions, and there's some interesting remnants of the same formula in Slavic mythologies, albeit with a Christianized turns of phrase, describing the biblical Adam's dismembered body parts as the origins of different groups of people. Cannibalism in creation myth seems to take on a different, sometimes stalling function, where primordial beings try to stifle change, usually by eating their own children. Cronus in Greek mythology is one example. We do see self-cannibalism, however, manifesting itself as a way of maintaining relation. Jormungandr is one such example. It's only when Jormungandr breaks away from this self-cannibalism that he turns onto the world tree and the Ragnarok occurs. Is child cannibalism used to demonize those outgroups? Absolutely. But I don't think it's a mutually exclusive explanation. I also think it's important to note that while child cannibalism is often used in demonization narratives, Wilby's analysis primarily features cases where the death in cannibalism is not permanent. They often include resurrection. There are mythic, perhaps even magical and ritual functions to it as well, and I think that those should be considered in our analysis. So, what do you think? Do you find the death divination interpretation convincing, or do you think that there's something more to it, or less to it? This video draws heavily on Wilby's book, The Visions of Isabel Gowdy, Magic, Witchcraft, and Dark Shamanism in 17th century Scotland, which is just packed with cool stuff, and which we also read last year in the Nordic Animism book club that I moderate and that you get access to via Patreon. So if you're interested in discussing some awesome books like this one, consider supporting the channel. Thanks for watching and see you around.